Hello, and welcome to JavaScript Marathon presented by This.Labs. We are thrilled to be bringing you a day full of training. My name is Tara Hampton, and I will be your host today. Are you looking to add testing to your skill set or just feel confident pushing to production? Well, you're in luck. In this session, we'll be walking through the process of installing, configuring, and writing a critical path test using Cypress. Training you today is Cecelia Martinez. Cecelia, welcome.
Hello,
We are so happy to have you here today. Cecelia is a success manager at Cypress and a volunteer with Women Who Code Front End and Out in Tech Atlanta. If you have any questions or comments after today's session, feel free to reach out to her directly on Twitter at Cecelia Creates, also shown in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide there. On your screen. She's also going to be having some fun interactive stuff throughout her presentation that you're going to want to pay attention to. So make note of that Twitter handle for later. You'll be glad that you did. And of course, we couldn't do this without our sponsors. Our sponsor today is This.Labs, your partners in modern digital transformation, specializing in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. You can find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Do you find keeping up with the constantly evolving technologies a struggle? Do you want to bring your team up to speed on one of the latest technologies? This.Labs offers personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. Contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. And if you're familiar at all with This Dot, you may already know that we put on weekly meetups online covering various frameworks and topics. This Dot's online meetups are an amazing opportunity for developers and enthusiasts alike to engage with the global tech community no matter where they are in the world. For the latest schedule and links to join, go to this.co. And on that note, Cecelia, I am going to kick it over to you. Again, thank you so much for being here. We're very happy to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here. So yes, I am Cecelia Martinez, going to be talking to you today about end-to-end testing with Cypress. If you'd like to follow along or code along, this is the address to the repository that we'll be using today. It is a fork of our Cypress testing workshop, specifically made for this talk. So it's kind of taking a full day workshop into 1 hour. And so that's what we'll be covering today. So you can go ahead and take a look at that repository if you'd like to follow along or check out the examples that we're going to talk about. Okay. So like I said, I'm Cecelia Martinez. I'm a success engineer at Cypress. I am based out of Atlanta, Georgia. I am a volunteer with Women Who Code Front End. I'm a track evangelist. And then additionally, I'm also on the Out in Tech leadership team and a founding member of the Atlanta chapter of Out in Tech, which supports the LGBTQ+ community in tech. You can get in touch with me. I am Cecelia Creates on Twitter and GitHub. And you can see I also have my handle on the lower right-hand side of most of my slides. And then additionally, I'm also on GitHub at Cecelia Creates. All right, so I do want to, before we get started, talk about, we're going to be having a couple of opportunities for participation today. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to ask some questions. And if you could throw some answers in the chat, if you think you know the answer, I'll be picking some of the responses to send a sticker pack. So I have quite a bit of a wide variety of stickers from attending different conferences and just kind of all the different meetups and volunteer groups that I organize with. And so kind of wanted to share the wealth. So if you need some stickers for your laptop or anything like that, keep an eye on some of the questions and those opportunities and make sure that you throw those in the chat. And once, if you do answer a question correctly and you win a sticker pack, just please reach out to me either on Twitter or you can also, on Twitter, the best way. Send me a DM and I can get that set up for you. All right, so let's go ahead and start talking about what Cypress is. So Cypress is a testing framework. It's JavaScript based, and it's for anything that runs in a browser. The test runner is free and open source, so you can always take a look at the source code online on GitHub. Like I said, the Cypress runs in a browser, an actual browser, alongside your application code. It has built-in libraries, so if you're familiar with Mocha, Chai, and jQuery selectors, those libraries are built in to Cypress. Additionally, it has built-in waits and retries. So if you've used other end-to-end testing frameworks, essentially what's happened sometimes is elements take too long to appear on the page, or an API call might be taking a little bit longer than expected, and tests could fail when really there's not actually a failure with the code base. So Cypress has built-in waits and retries where it will allow for a certain amount of time to pass for an element to appear or for a route to resolve or a request to resolve before failing the test. Additionally, the test runner has a lot of different features that make it helpful for debugging tests and when you're writing tests. There's a time travel feature that allows you to click through each step of your test and see what the application was doing at that time. It also has very detailed error reporting that allows you to click right into the line of code that caused the test to fail. Additionally, there's artifacts like screenshots and videos to allow you to see what's causing test failures and what your application is doing during your test. We have some great documentation, and we also have because we're open source, we have a lot of community plugins, and there's a lot of different integrations that can be utilized and leveraged with Cypress. And there's also the optional Cypress dashboard if you are looking to leverage parallelization for your test runs, additional analytics, and integrations. I wanted to share some resources to help you learn Cypress. So we're very community oriented. We have a lot of resources that we make available for anyone to use. Like I mentioned before, we have our Cypress documentation. There's multiple sections to our documentation. We have a really robust guide section. This is only a small list of the guides that we have available. Additionally, we have the actual documentation for our Cypress API, which includes all of the commands for our API. We have examples and recipes. We have our plugins, and then we also have a frequently asked question. We have our Cypress Real World app. This is actually very exciting. It was released pretty recently. I did a talk on this last week. But the Cypress Real World app is a full stack React application. It's like a Venmo or PayPal, and it allows you to see Cypress in action on a production level app, and allows you to learn, tinker, experiment, and practice, and get an example of what some best practices are. So definitely recommend checking that out. Additionally, there's a link to the Cypress repository on GitHub. We have a Gitter community chat. We have a Cypress blog, and then I also like to plug Gleb, our VP of Engineering, has his own personal blog that has a lot of additional resources. On our documentation, we do have a search functionality. It looks at recipes, our kitchen sink examples, and then also our blog posts. So it doesn't just search the documentation, it also searches additional resources. And then I wanted to point out this URL. So with our documentation, if you do on.cypress.io/ and you type in an API command, so whether it's click or type or get or request, it will take you directly to the page in our documentation for that command. Additionally, you can also try searching for certain queries. So you'll see some of these links throughout the presentation, but in some cases you can also search topics like code coverage or like writing and organizing tests, and use this format and it'll take you to that section of our documentation. Okay, so time for the first question. And so everybody get ready. So if you think you know the answer, hopefully you do, you can throw the answer in the chat. So true or false, Cypress emulates a browser to run your test. So we'll see if we, so again, if you know the answer, feel free to throw it into the chat. Could win a sticker pack. So true or false, Cypress emulates a browser to run your test. And all right, so I'll let y'all answer that question in the chat whenever you get a chance, and whoever wants to grab a sticker pack, just go ahead and throw that comment in there. All right, So, and I will go ahead and answer that a little bit later on once we get some responses. All right, so we're going to take a look at the application we're going to be using today to run through our code. Oh, wow, look at this. Okay, we got some answers. Yes, so the answer is false. It looks like got quite a few responses, but the first one is like magx777. So if you could send me a DM on Twitter, I'll get you your sticker pack. And that is, yeah, so the answer is false. Cypress runs in an actual browser, and we currently support Chrome, Firefox, and then Microsoft Edge, so Chromium-based browsers in Firefox. So your tests run in an actual browser, not an emulator. So that means that you're going to see what your app does in the real world, in the real browser environment, and so it allows you to see true behavior. Okay, so going back to our application, we're going to be using, like I said, it's a fork of the Testing Workshop Cypress repository. It's a to-do app. Yay! I know y'all are all very excited about this, and you're probably very familiar with to-do apps. So it's a Vue and REST server application. And app functionality, like as you can probably guess, you can add tasks, toggle tasks, complete, and you can delete tasks. So we have it open here. It's just running locally, localhost 3000. And this probably looks very, very familiar if you've done different types of tutorials and things like that. So this is the application that we're going to be working through today. And again, you can access it from this GitHub repository. The branch that we're working on is specifically called JS Marathon. All right, so if we're getting started, so like I said, if you'd like to follow along, or if you're watching this later and you want to follow along with the repository, you could essentially would go to this GitHub and you would go ahead and clone it. So you start by cloning the repository, Cypress.io/testing workshop, Cypress. You would cd into the actual folder once you clone it. You would run git fetch, and what this allows you to do is it allows you to pull the branches that are at the origin that you don't have locally, because you're going to want to check out the JS Marathon branch. And then finally, you can npm install in, and that will bring in all the dependencies, one of which is already Cypress. So again, if you're following along, you want to use the same repository that we're using, you want to clone it, fetch, check out the branch, and then install. If you're not following along, or if you're starting from scratch, this is how you install Cypress on your machine. So in the root of your project directory, you can use either npm or yarn, but it's npm install Cypress or yarn add Cypress. And you just want to save it to your development dependencies as a best practice. I did want to mention that we don't have a global install option, and we don't recommend that because the configuration should really be specific to your project. So if you have multiple different projects, you're going to want to have Cypress installed in each project in order to have that configuration. Okay, so after you've installed Cypress, the first step is to run the command to actually open the Cypress Test Runner. So you can use npm or you can use yarn, but in the root of your project directory, you'd run npx cypress open or yarn run cypress open. So if you're running this for the first time in a new project, a few things are going to happen. You're going to see a terminal command that validates that Cypress can run on your machine. It's going to add a Cypress folder to your project, and it's also going to create a cypress.json configuration file. Again, if you're using the repository for this project, that's already included. However, if you're starting from scratch, this is what's going to happen when you first open the test runner. So I mentioned that Cypress will automatically create a Cypress folder in your project repository. This is the structure of that folder. So it contains a fixtures folder that allows you to store data that you want to access during your tests. So for example, if you had a list of users, like username and passwords that you want to be able to use to log in, if your app has a product library or product catalog and you want to be able to access that data, you could store it in this fixture folder. In the integration folder is where we actually store the tests. So if you're opening it from scratch, you're going to see an examples folder with a wide variety of what we call our kitchen sink examples that allows you to click through and run some example tests. In this case, we have one test file because we're doing a critical path test, And so that's a criticalpath.spec.js file. You can also use, just no .spec. You can just use .js, or you can use .ts as well. And then there's the plugins folder, which has just an index that allows you to set up plugins if you have any for your project. And then there's a support folder, which essentially contains any kind of commands that you want to run when you're running your test. And then you can also create custom commands, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. All right, so talking about the Cypress configuration file, there is quite a bit that you can do in here. I wanted to point out two specific things. As a best practice, we recommend setting the base URL for your application in the cypress.json file. This prevents you from having to type out localhost 3000 every single time you want to visit your page. So by setting it in your cypress.json configuration file, it'll automatically prepend, or it'll put that URL in front of any additional paths that you might designate in your test code. I also wanted to point out that we're setting a viewport width and height to run our tests in. So there's a lot of different options for setting your viewport. You could do it dynamically within your test. You can do it in a configuration file. You can also do it by passing environment variables. In this case, we're running a single test, and I wanted to essentially have it be a consistent viewport whenever we run it. So that's why I'm setting it here in the configuration file. All right, taking a look at test structure. So if you if this looks familiar, you probably know the answer to this next question. So here's another chance to grab a sticker pack. So get your chat fingers ready. So what test runner library does Cypress have built in? So I know there's a little bit of a delay, so I'll let some answers come through before I answer that. So while that is coming in, I wanted to point out what our test file actually looks like. So this would be an example of one of our, critical path spec.js files. Up top, we have where we're pulling in our reference types of Cypress. So what this does is it brings in intelligent code completion and IntelliSense for your VS Code. So highly, highly, highly recommend doing this in your test file so that you have access to all of the commands and information of the Cypress API. It's very robust, so we'll be taking a look at it. Okay, so we're getting some answers. So yes, Rob Martin coming through with Mocha. So if you, like I said, if this looks familiar, it's probably because you're familiar with Mocha, which is a test runner and a way for setting up tests. So I'm just gonna, Rob Martin, if you want to send me a DM on Twitter, I'll get you your sticker pack. So when we take a look at this, that's where these words describe, before each, and it come from. This comes from Mocha, and that helps us organize and structure our test file. So we have a describe block is essentially how it's called, and that holds all of our tests. Typically, you want to categorize or contain your tests based on certain categories. So in this case, we have one critical path test, so it just says our tests. But that's how you essentially contain all of the tests that are going to be running together. There's a before each. This is called a hook. So Mocha has some built-in hooks. You have before each, after, and after each. What before each allows you to do is it actually runs before each test. So if, for example, you needed to reset your database, or you wanted to visit your home page, or you needed to log in before each test, rather than having to hard code that individually, you can put that in the before each, and it'll run automatically in between every single one of your tests. And then finally, we have our test blocks. So you can have multiple it blocks within your describe. So you can have multiple tests that run within your spec file. I do want to comment that I like to use describe and it, but if you prefer context or the other format when using Mocha, that's also built in, and you can definitely use that. This is what I'm used to. So hopefully that's not too confusing for anybody. Okay. And again, oh yes, I wanted to point out on the URL here, this is using one of those on Cypress links. So on.cypress.io/writing and organizing tests takes you to the section of our documentation about writing and organizing tests. Pretty exciting. So just a little bit more about test structure. So we talked about what the actual code structure looks like for organizing your tests, but what is actually, what kind of steps do we walk through when we're doing our test? First things first, we visit the page, right? So we can't test our application until we're on our application. And so that's always the first step, is visiting our application. Then we typically query for an element. And so, we for example, we may want to grab the header or grab a button or an input that we need to action on. Once we have that element, we typically perform a command. So if you think about what your user would do if they go to your home page and they click on a login button, the clicking of the button would be the command. And then we make assertions. So when your user goes to your home page, they find that login button and they click it, a few things should happen, right? They should go to a login page, or there should be a modal that pops up, or it should allow them to input their username and password. So we make assertions to ensure that what we expect to happen is actually happening. And then finally, we repeat as needed. So with end-to-end testing, it's not like unit tests. So we're not testing very specific units of functionality. We're not testing individual functions. We're not even really testing components. We're testing the actual journey that your user goes through. So you can repeat these steps as many times as needed throughout a single test. Okay, and so let's go ahead and dive into the Cypress API Basics. So we're going to talk about some of the Cypress terminology. We do try to keep it as English syntax-like as possible to make it beginner-friendly. We have people that have no JavaScript experience at all and are able to get started with writing tests with Cypress because of that. So let's take a look at what some of the basics are of the Cypress API. So all of the commands start with cy, cy.get and cy.contains are essentially our two most common selectors. So if you think of cy.get as like query selector, it works the same way, and it allows you to query for a wide variety of different elements on your page. Cy.contains is different. What it does instead is it searches for text. So if you were to pass cy.contains hello world, it would look for any element on your page that contains the text hello world. After the selectors, we have our commands. So we have commands, a wide variety of commands. We have cy.click and cy.type are the ones that I use kind of most often. There's also cy.check. But if you think about the types of things that your user would do, that's what these commands replicate. So our commands do have built-in actionability checks. So what that means is that Cypress thinks like your user. And if your user goes and there's a button on the page, but it's blocked by something, or it has a certain CSS class that makes it not visible, then your user won't actually be able to click on it. So Cypress automatically tests for actionability with these commands. So when you think about things like check, uncheck, select, trigger, which triggers things like hover or mouse down events, it's always going to make these default assertions. So that allows you to make sure that if your test code can do it, then that means your user could also do it. And that's what you really want, is you want that confidence that your user is going to be able to use the application the way that you expect. And then after our commands, we have our assertions. So I know somebody in the comments mentioned this, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but we do have the try assertion library built in. This includes both the BDD, so the behavior-driven development, and also the test-driven development types of assertions. So for this presentation, I use should. That's just one that I like. Again, you can use expect, or you can also use assert, whichever you're more comfortable with. And then also wanted to point out, I saw that Raj also mentioned in the chat that we have sign-on, and we do. That sign-on.js is an additional library that's built in that allows you to make some additional assertions. So definitely check that out if you're familiar with sign-on and interested. Okay, great. So custom commands. I mentioned this earlier. It's a little bit more of a intermediate topic, but I'd like to cover it because I feel like it makes your life so much easier when you're writing tests. So if you bear with me a little bit, within your support folder, there's a commands.js file. This comes automatically. However, by default, there's nothing in there except for some information. This allows you, though, to add commands to Cypress that you can leverage throughout your test code without having to rewrite them each time. So the first one I want to highlight actually comes from our real world app, which I just mentioned. This is used pretty heavily, but one of our best practices when selecting elements is to use a data attribute. So this is an HTML attribute that's actually put right onto the tag in your code that allows you to grab that exact item. So rather than using a class or something that could be brittle and change, causing your test to be flaky or to fail, by using a data attribute selector, you can get exactly the element that you want and there's no confusion. So what this custom command does is it adds a command called get by cell or get by selector, and it takes in a selector and it automatically returns our sci.get with the entire HTML attribute passed through. So like I mentioned earlier, sci.get is like query selector. So you can query by class with a dot notation. You can query by ID with a hashtag or pound sign. You can query by HTML tag name, like like li or h1. And then you can also query by these HTML attributes. So this allows you to kind of do that in a quicker way without having to type it out manually each time. The other type of command that you can use is an actual command to perform an action. So in this case, we have a to-do list. And guess what? In order to test our to-do list, we probably have to create some to-dos. There's a way to do this manually. You essentially would get these item, the input, and you type into it the name of the to-do, and you hit enter. But having to type that out manually in your code over and over and over again can get a little bit tedious. So instead, we've created a custom command here, where all we do is we pass through the name of the to-do, and it creates it for us. So we'll see that leverage throughout our code today. Okay, so done a lot of talking, a lot of slides. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual test runner. Let's look at some code. So we're going to go ahead and open up VS Code. And just to kind of show you here on the side, hopefully this font is big enough. I tried to pump it up as much as I could. We have a Cypress folder. So we have our to-do MVC folder here, which contains our actual application code. Then we have a Cypress folder. And as I mentioned before, we have our fixtures, integration, plugins, and our support folder. And then, of course, we have, if you're familiar with VS Code as your IDE, and we have the actual test file here. I've already started up the application, so let's go ahead and open up another terminal here. And we're just going to do npx cypress open to open up the test runner. Give that a second to open up. So this is essentially this is the test runner. We have on the top sorry about that. We have across the top the name of our repository, some links to support in our documentation. You can log in if you're leveraging the Cypress dashboard. However, that's not required. Here we have our test file, so we can see it's automatically pulling in the integration folder from our repository, and it's automatically pulling in whatever test files it can find. And if we hover over this and we see this open an IDE button, and we click on that, it actually opens the test file in your IDE in VS Code. There we go. Close the terminal here. Additionally, if you have multiple test files, you could search for them. We only have one. That's not a problem. This dropdown allows you to change the browser that you're running the tests in. It'll automatically pull whatever browsers that you have available on your machine. So I do not have Edge or Firefox installed in my machine, so that's why they're not showing up. However, if I did, they would be here in the dropdown to run my tests. So today we're just going to be running the testing from. So again, if you're leveraging the Cypress dashboard, this is where your runs would appear. And then we also have the settings. So I wanted to point out the configuration setting here. This is pretty interesting because it shows all the default configurations in Cypress. And then it also shows where we've overridden them and the source of that override. So here we can see that the viewport width and height have been overridden, and that's coming from our configuration file. And then we have our base URL, which is also being overridden by our configuration file. But this also shows how else you can override. You can pass things through an environment file. You can pass them through as environment variable when you run your command, and then you can also have things set from CI or plugins. Additionally, on the settings page, you have your node and your proxy settings. But I wanted to show file opener preference. So this is where you can choose which code IDE you'd like your test to open in. And then we also have an experiments tab, which allows you to set up some of the experimental features that we currently offer. All right, so if we go back to our test, let's go ahead and take a look and see what happens when we click on it to run it. Okay, so that was a test run. Everything passed. Good job. So let's take a look and see what this looks like. So this is the browser that the test runner opens. On the right-hand side, it shows our application. We can see up here in the top right-hand corner that we have a viewport of 600 by 800. Again, that's what we set in our configuration. On the left-hand side, we have the command log. So this is what shows each and every step of our test. And it allows us to hover over. And as you can see, as we hover over on the right-hand side, our application is showing what actions and what things took place. So right away, you can get a sense that if something fails, you can see everything that's happened before then. So what does it look like when something fails? Let's take a look and see. So if we go back to our test code, I'm not going to go too much in the code right just a second, but let's say we change this to don'ts. If we save, Cypress runs in watch mode, so it automatically reruns the test whenever it detects a change. Okay, so in this case, we can see that the test failed. What kind of information do we get? We can see in our test body that the sci contains, which again searches for text on the page, timed out retrying, expected to find contents to don'ts, but never did. It shows us which command failed in our test code. And if we click on this, it takes us right to that line in our IDE. And we say, oh, to don'ts, what was I thinking? It should be to dos. So another thing that we can do is if we know this test failed and all the other ones didn't, let's just take a look at this test right now. So we can go ahead and add .only after our if block. And if we hover over this because of IntelliSense being pulled in, it tells us, what that command does. So in this case, it's only going to run this specific test. And we've updated here to from to don'ts. Go ahead and fix that to to-dos, and we'll resave. We'll run our test again. Runs so fast, and this time it passes. So it was able to find to-dos on the page. I also want to demonstrate our selector playground. So if you're in the process of writing tests, I highly recommend having the test runner open while you're writing your tests because it'll watch for changes. You'll be able to see in real time what things are passing or failing. The other reason I recommend it is because of something called the selector playground. So if you click on this icon here, Open Selector Playground, you can actually hover and click on areas of your application to see what selector will pull that. So for example, we can see here, if we hover over to-dos, data sci equals app title. If we click on that, we could just go ahead and it shows sci.get data sci equals app title. And we can copy that to our clipboard and put that right in our test file. So if you don't have access to your code base or you're not necessarily sure what the most specific way to get an element is, this selector playground can kind of help point you in the right direction. Again, best practice is to use an HTML data attribute. Okay, so that is the test runner specifically. Again, there's a lot more in here that we're going to dive into once we kind of talk about the test code. Oh yes, one of the things that I did want to show as well is you have access to your dev tools the same way that you do in a regular browser, because again, this is a regular browser. So that's really helpful to view, for example, our network requests. So we have a before each hook here that makes a post request to reset our database. So when we run our tests with the dev tools open, we can see all of the network requests that are taking place if we wanted to view any of the responses. We also have our console. Okay, that's fine. And we can go ahead and click on any of these commands and it'll print it to the console. So we clicked on the request and we can see the command was request. It has the request body, URL, headers, and it has the response as well. And we can do this for any of our commands. So we can also click on the contains to do, and we can see what element it actually yielded specifically if we wanted to confirm the HTML. The HTML element that's pulling back. Okay, so time for another question. And then how can we access multiple temp variables? Okay, and then I will have a little bit of time for questions at the end. I know that there's probably some specific questions that people have, but I want to be able to keep moving. So feel free to also DM me any questions that you have on Twitter as well. And I will take a look at the YouTube after to respond. So time for another sticker pack question. So how do we run a single test in our test file? So it's kind of a, you know, just talked about this not too long ago. So hopefully we'll get some good answers on this one. For now, I'm going to go ahead and close out the test runner. So we can either do that by closing this browser, or we can just hit stop and it'll automatically close. And we can come back here. So again, on this slide, it just kind of shows an overview of the test runner. We have our test status menu, which shows how many tests passed, how many failed, how long the test took. We can rerun our test at any time. It has a URL preview, our viewport sizing, the preview of our application, and then the command log that allows you to step through each step of the test. Okay, so we took a look at some code. We talked about, so first we started by talking about what Cypress is in general. We took a look at the test runner and a little bit about what some of the API commands are and how to actually write the tests. I wanted to talk about best practices around deciding what to test, because that's another question that we get a lot. And especially if you're new to end-to-end testing and you're only familiar with unit testing, the approach is definitely different. So end-to-end tests focus on the features. Like I said before, they can definitely be long and contain multiple commands and multiple assertions. And then you also would want to examine the side effects of actions. So when we think about end-to-end testing, essentially what we're thinking about is when a user does something, is the behavior that happens expected? Okay, awesome. Starting to get some, I can tell there's a little bit of a delay. So that's, yeah, so it looks like, Becca. So Becca, you win a sticker pack. So the answer is dot only. So yeah, so you would add dot only after your it block to run just a single test. All right, so Becca, I think we're actually already friends on Twitter. So feel free to send me a DM and I'll get you your sticker packet. So, all right, going back to what to test. So yes, the approach for end-to-end tests is different than unit tests. And it's really important to what the actual end user's workflow is. So we talk about approaches to what to test. These are the two main approaches that I see: code coverage and case coverage. And one is, it's kind of like thinking of like quantitative versus qualitative, right? So code coverage, what that does, and it keeps track of how much of your code base is actually executed when you run your tests. So for example, if you run your tests and only 80% of your code base actually activates or runs or executes, or whichever word you want to use to describe it, then that means that 20% of your code base is not being tested at all. And code coverage, which essentially typically it's a plugin where you instrument your code and it tracks that and generates reports, can give you insight there. However, that's not the only thing that you want to measure. There's also case coverage. And what case coverage refers to typically is test cases, which in a lot of times mimic user stories. So when you think about test cases, it describes what the critical paths are and what the different use cases are for your users and your application. So for example, you could have 100% code coverage of your tests, but if there's a certain functionality or an edge case that you're testing that doesn't work from your user perspective, it doesn't really matter if you have 100% code coverage if your user can't do what they need to do on your site. So like I said, we have long user journeys along a critical path. So what's a critical path, you're probably asking, because I asked the same question myself when I first heard this. So a critical path, it may also hear it referred to as a happy path, but it's what does your user absolutely need to do with your application? What is the core functionality? So for example, if you have an e-commerce site, you really want to make sure that they can add an item to a cart and check out, right? That is what 100% needs to happen. If you have a social network or like a blog platform, they should be able to write and share a post, right? If you have a learning platform, for example, like Udemy or something where you're selling courses, you want to make sure that whoever comes to your site can search for and then enroll in a course. Those are some examples of critical paths. So if your user goes to your site expecting to be able to do something, can they do it? And then finally, we talk about assertions. So what types of things do we want to make assertions about? Because you can assert on everything. If you've done there's like, I mean, there's all types of things and assertions that you could make. So what is the most important for your test, and like how do you decide that? So types of assertions that you can make, page elements render as expected. This is in terms of content. So, is the text on your page correct? Style, is it formatted the correct way? Is it, is the color scheme working up correctly? Is it consistent with your design system that you have for your front end application? And then also things like visibility and actionability. Is it rendering and is it actually showing the right way? Is there another element covering it? If you're in a different viewport, does some text, go off to the side? And those are the things that Cypress actually checks for you, the visibility and the actionability checks when for the certain commands. Other things that you want to assert on are user actions resulting in expected behavior. So if a user, like I said, goes to your site, clicks on a login button, does the URL after they click on that button, is it /login like it's supposed to be? If you have event listeners on your page, are they firing correctly? If you hover over something, does the expected text appear? Does a tooltip appear where it's supposed to? And then finally, you want to assert on expected side effects. So going back to kind of like login profile authentication, if you have a user who goes to their user profile page and they update their email address and their profile information and they hit save, and there's a modal pops up that says, profile information saved, but the corresponding call to your API to actually update their profile never goes out, or it never updates the database, then that's a problem. So everything may be working on the front end of your application, but Cypress allows you to make sure that requests are going out the same way that you expect, and you can make assertions on those side effects to ensure that the back end of your application, or at least the connection between the front end and the back end, is working as expected. Okay. And then some additional testing methods that you can employ, and these are a little bit more advanced, but I want to point them out because they're very interesting and very helpful. And we do have some guides within Cypress for how to incorporate these into your Cypress tests. So one is visual testing. So this is actually comparing the visual image of your site there's a couple of different ways to do it. You can use it with screenshots, snapshots, or and kind of like an AUT of your or DOM snapshot, so to speak, of your site. There's API testing. So Cypress isn't always the most efficient way to test your API because it does spin up a browser. However, if you're going to be spinning up a browser anyway, you can definitely leverage Cypress for API testing. That's what we do in the real world app example. They initially started using a different framework for API testing when they were developing the app, but then found that Cypress was helpful in validating the back end before getting to the front end. There's also a couple of blog posts here about how you can leverage Cypress for API testing. We also have a code coverage guide. So as I mentioned earlier, if you are interested in getting a more quantitative look at what your test is covering in your code base, we have information and we have a plugin for that. And then also, if you're familiar with behavior-driven development and you use a framework like Cucumber, you can leverage that with Cypress also. So there's a link to that as well. Okay, time for their question. What are the two approaches to evaluating a test suite? So again, what are the two approaches to evaluating a test suite? It's a hint. One of them is that more quantitative method. One of them is more qualitative. So I'll keep an eye out for the answers in the chat. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our test code and walk through it. I want to make sure that we definitely have some time to do this. So this is our test file. It's our critical path.spec.js file. So I'm pulling in our reference types, so we have IntelliSense, so that when we hover over, for example, site.request, it shows the types, it tells you exactly what it does, and it gives you an example. So we have our describe block, which essentially describes a suite of tests. We're describing it as our just to do MVC. Here we have our before each hook. Again, this is going to run before each of our tests. And what does that before each hook do? It resets to-dos and visits the site. So we're using site.request. So site.request allows you to actually just create an HTTP request for any endpoint. We have an endpoint already in the back end of our application that resets the database. So from within our test code, we're actually manipulating our application API in order to reset our database in between each test. So we didn't have to create anything special for this, right? We're just leveraging what the functionality already built into our application, and because we're running right alongside of our app in a browser, we can do that. So we're making a post request to our reset endpoint with just some empty to-dos between each test. And then we're also visiting. So site.visit, this is, again, one you'll be very, very familiar with. This is how you visit your actual application page. So like I said, the first step is you actually have to go to your page. And because we have a base URL set in our configuration file, our localhost 3000, we've already defined that elsewhere. All we have to do is put a slash here, and that's just going to go to the root directory of our localhost 3000. Okay, looks like we got some answers coming in. So Alan, Allan, Alan, you have won a sticker pack. So feel free to send me a DM on Twitter, Cecelia Creates, and I will get that out to you. Just writing down your names here. Okay, so that's our before each hook. And you can see how it's quite powerful. Otherwise, you'd have to copy and paste or type out. If you're not like me, I always copy paste, which is bad. But in each of your if blocks. And as we say, don't repeat yourself, right? You want to keep things dry. And so that's why the before each hook is very helpful in this regard. So let's go ahead and take out our it.only because we're going to want to run all of our tests. But our first test here is it loads the page elements. And there's a few different ways here that we're checking those things. The first is we're using a sci.contains. So sci.contains to-dos. This is the test that we saw run and fail and pass earlier. You can also use a class selector. So we're getting our new to-do, and it should, again, I'm using the should assertions, but you can use whatever you like. It should have an HTML attribute, so have at of placeholder, and placeholder should show what needs to be done. So if we go to our application, we can see here that we have an input with the placeholder that says what needs to be done. That's what we're testing against. And then finally, we're using here our custom command. So again, if we go back to our commands, we looked at this earlier, we have a custom command that allows us to just pass through a data selector. In this case, we're getting show all, and we're saying it should not exist. So when we start the test, we have no to-dos. If we have no to-dos, then there should be no element that's showing all of the to-dos. So that's just confirming that we have no elements on the page when we start. Our next test, again, we're thinking about the core functionality of our app. You need to be able to add a to-do, you need to be able to toggle it complete or incomplete, and you need to be able to delete it, right? So if you have a to-do app, like that's your bread and butter, that's your critical path, you absolutely have to be able to do those things. So the first step is adding to-dos. And again, I'm demonstrating a few different ways to do this. The first is you can do it manually, exactly like how your user would do. So you say, okay, I'm going to go and get my new to-do input, and I'm going to type make slides for JS Marathon Talk, enter. And it'll step through those commands, and it'll type it out, and you'll see it typing on the screen, and it'll hit enter, you'll see the to-do added. You can see how that would get tedious to type multiple times. So the second example, we're leveraging our create to-do command, and we're just passing through write tests, and it's going to automatically take care of the rest of this. The other option, which I'm very excited to share this, which I think is one of the cool things about Cypress, is that we can actually just use our application state to create a to-do. So if, for example, you wanted your test to run a little bit faster and it didn't really matter to you how you're creating the to-dos, like if you don't want them to type it out each and every time, then you could have a custom command, for example, that just, in this case, we're leveraging our app store and we're dispatching the set to do and then the add to do commands. And again, these already exist in our application. Like we didn't have to write anything additional to be able to do this. We're tapping right into the code of our app. And that's creating a to-do called practice. So after we've created our three to-dos, we need to assert that they actually are there. So the simplest way to do this, because I care mostly about the text, I don't necessarily care about the HTML, is we're just doing 3 sci.contains with the to-do items that we've added. Okay, so the next test, once we've added our to-dos, we're going to toggle completion. So again, we're going ahead and just leveraging our custom command here to create a to-do. We're confirming that it was created with sci.contains. We're going and getting the toggle. We're getting all the elements that have a class of toggle. We're going to the first one, and then we're checking that box. And that check is just, like checking a box, like checking any kind of input or toggle. And then we're confirming that the to-do was marked completed. So again, we're getting that item that we just clicked on, and it should have class of completed. And again, you kind of like, even if you don't know JavaScript, just reading through this, you can get a sense of what's going on. And then we have, in this case, we're leveraging another custom command, toggle first to do, which we can see here is essentially just repeating the same steps that we just did. And then it's asserting that it does no longer has a class of completed. Last but not least, deleting the to-do. So again, we're creating a to-do, we're toggling it complete, we're using our custom commands, we don't have to type them out from scratch. We are clicking on the destroy button, and then we're confirming that our to-do list has a length of 0, meaning that it's been deleted. So let's go ahead and run this test now that we have an understanding of what the code looks like. Okay, so everything passes as expected. And again, we kind of looked at this earlier, but we have new to do. We expect it to have an attribute placeholder with a value of what needs to be done. And then we expect null to not exist. That's good. Be a little concerned if null did exist. And so now we have our add to do. So as you can see here, our before each hook, we're resetting our database, clearing out whatever to-dos that we had there. We're making a new to-do. And then this is where we're leveraging our app store to, so you can see, instead of typing out, so in this case, let me see, let me find it, make new to do. Oh, that's right. And up here, instead of actually typing it out when you can see it runs through, it automatically just puts it right into the field. We're setting the to-do, and then it's adding the to-do with this dispatch. And so we can see that all 3 exist on our app, so we know that they've been added. Next test, toggles complete. So we create a to-do, we confirm it exists, we get this toggle class, it's highlighted there, we check it, and then we can see that it's marked off and it has a class of completed. We go back to the toggle, we click on it again, and so you can use check or click. I use both so you can see both cases. And then now expects it to not have class of completed as expected. Last but not least, deleting the to-do. So again, we've created a to-do, we've marked it as checked, we click the destroy button, and then it's gone. So we have a critical path for our to-do application. Okay, so let's go back to our slides. Last thing I wanted to do is go through a couple more best practices while we have a little bit of time left. And so these are all from our documentation. We actually have a best practices guide. So if you find these interesting, definitely recommend reading that guide and getting some more. But I picked these specifically because they're related to end-to-end testing and to Cypress. Oh, sorry about that. Using my phone as a controller. Okay, so the first one is when you're selecting elements, I mentioned this before, the best practice is to use a data attribute. You can use data sci or data test, but to designate that that's an attribute specifically for getting selectors when you're testing. And this allows it also to isolate it from CSS or JS changes. So I was asked before why a class isn't necessarily the best reason because to select something. So if you have a redesign of your class, a redesign of your site, and the class changes, then all of a sudden that selector doesn't exist anymore and your test is going to fail. But if nobody ever touches that HTML attribute because there's no need to, then that's always going to be consistent in your test cases. Another best practice is tests should always be able to run independently from one another and still pass. So I mentioned that you can have long tests, and you can. However, you don't necessarily want the state of a test to depend on a previous test. So for example, if we added all of our to-dos in our first test, and then our second test, we marked them to complete, but we didn't recreate those to-dos, then if somebody changes that first test or alters it in any way, then that could break our second test. So that's why we have that reset before each hook and then to essentially get a clean slate in between each of our tests. And we can leverage things like our app store or custom commands to reset our state for each test. So I also mentioned that Cypress has built-in waits and retries. So you shouldn't really need in most cases to wait for an arbitrary period of time. You do have that option. So you can say in the middle of my test, wait 3 seconds before moving on. Has the best practice though, typically if you are waiting for an arbitrary amount of time, it's because you're actually waiting for something to load or something to happen. And it's more effective and less flaky to wait for that thing to actually happen than to have to guess how long it will take. So for example, you can use route aliases. So if I keep going back to login, if you're logging in and you know that there's a request that completes to your backend once they've logged in, you can wait for that request and you can essentially mark it in Cypress and say, don't move on until this request completes. And then now that you know that that's completed, then you can make your assertions on the page once you've logged in, for example. Okay, all right, so we have about 5 minutes left. This is down to the wire, but we're doing good. We're finishing up here. So next steps. I did mention that we have a lot of guides in our documentation. So network request guide, highly, highly recommend once you're ready to move beyond the test that we wrote today. The network request guide goes into what I was just talking about, essentially, where you can spy on requests going to your back end, where you can stub out routes if you want to mock data or mock responses. So that's going to be really helpful once you're getting into that section of your testing. Same thing with the variable and aliases guide; those go hand in hand. If you have any questions about how to, for example, like store elements for later, or if you need to declare any kind of variables to use in your test code and you need to refer to it repeatedly, the variable and aliases guide will tell you the best practices for making sure that you're using those correctly in your tests. And then finally, we have our troubleshooting guide. If you do run into any problems or it just goes through how you can leverage our debugging, some of our additional troubleshooting methods. It also contains, we have an error messages guide. And we have, like I mentioned before, we have kind of a lot of robust resources around this. Speaking of resources, I wanted to share this again. It's the same slide as before, so nothing new, but I just felt like it was important enough to include twice. And so it is time for another question, another chance to grab your sticker pack. And this is probably this is actually the last one. So the question is, what do Cypress action commands like sci.click automatically check? And so if you don't know the actual exact word, that's okay. But if you can describe it, I'll give you points for that, like half points. But again, what do Cypress action commands like sci.click automatically check? So waiting for a few answers to come in there. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank everybody for your time and for your attention today and your participation. It's really love doing this, really love being able to talk about Cypress and testing in general. I'm a strong believer that testing just helps increase your confidence as a developer and helps you just write better code and really be able to provide the solutions that you want for your users. So like I said, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. I am on GitHub at Cecelia Creates, also on Twitter at Cecelia Creates. I'm on GitHub as Cypress Cecelia, specifically for anything Cypress related. I tend to double dip on my repos, so you'll see both. I contribute from both users. And then again, our link to our documentation, and then the link to the repository that we worked out of today. So all the test code that we worked out of today is on this repository. A link to these slides is also in that repository. So if you would like to click on any of the resources that we shared today, you can go to the repository and click on the slides here to see those. Those are publicly available. And okay, we're getting some answers. Actionability, nice. First question, first one. That's the exact word I was looking for. So Nectarios, if you could send me a DM, I will go ahead and get you your sticker pack. So. And I do see a couple of quick questions coming on. Yeah, so absolutely. So Electron is one of the browsers that we run in. So you can definitely test with the Electron browser. And then just taking a look and see if there's anything else I can answer quickly. I think there was one earlier about environment variables that I missed. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use environment variables across different tests. So we have an environment variables guide in our documentation. So you have multiple options. You can either have them in your configuration file. You can use cypress.env to create environment variables in your test file. There's a cypress.env.json file that you could leverage for environment variables. You can pass them through when you actually run your tests. And you can also use them as a .env when you pass it through using a CLI tool. There's plugins in order to override environment variables. And then you can also set up your test configuration specifically right here in your test code. So you can set up an environment variable there too. So hopefully oh yeah, page object model as a good practice. This is a really, really, really great question. So there's nothing in Cypress that prevents you from using page object model. If you like it, that's awesome. Definitely, definitely use it. I will say, Gleb, I mentioned him before. He has this really, really great blog post about using app actions instead of page objects. So I definitely recommend giving that a read if you're looking for other, other approaches. So I will also go ahead and I'll include that in the repository. I'll add that link to the repository as well. Okay, awesome. Thank you very, very much for all your questions and everything. So like I said, please feel free to reach out to me on GitHub, YouTube, Twitter, everything. And thanks again for all your participation. All right, have a great day.